secret. Every day, once a day, give yourself a present. Don't plan it, don't wait for it, just let it happen. It could be a new shirt in the men's store, a cat nap in your office chair, or...
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to quickly start by reviewing key aspects of each of the chapters and connecting them for you one more time. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because, of course, that can also be located in my weekly video lectures. So we can go ahead and get started. Renisa has asked about the ecosystem. Renisa, if you could be a little bit more specific with your question, let me know. Oh, exosystem. Okay, that makes a little bit more sense. I was like, what ecosystem? All right, so we'll get to that actually as we move on throughout the chapters. Thank you, Renisa. Luis and Janine, I am still waiting on questions from you, so that'll be something that I'll be waiting for. Yeah, Renisa, I was like, what? But this is not... I'll try to answer your questions about ecosystems, but I'm not sure myself. So, we've been through quite a decent amount of chapters. I know that it seems like it's been just a little while. Hello. But we've been through a decent amount of information and a decent amount of other things that have really, I think, helped us kind of get a good foundation for the chapters ahead. But I wanted to take this moment halfway through the semester and just kind of pump the brakes a little bit, pause and think about and review these chapters before we move on to the heftier chapters that we're going to get to later on. So chapter 1 was very straightforward. I think we just kind of talked about definitions. We talked about what different family structures kind of look like. Hi, Citily. Make sure you type in a question for me, Citily. So one of the things that is really important from this chapter is that it provides us with two things. It provides us with a list of family configurations, communication axioms, and ultimately different models of how to analyze how family configurations and communication axioms interact. So I'm going to quickly review the definition of a communication axiom so we can get it. I'm not going to review the ones for family because I feel like that's pretty straightforward. But remember that communication is a process. It's a co-construction of definitions that involves codes, that involves context, and is a transaction that takes place on two levels. And so as we take a look at this type of communication, what we're really looking for here is an understanding that communication is something you do with people. It's not something you do to people. And oftentimes we frame communication as, I'm going to do this to someone, right? I'm going to talk to someone. And what's really important to note is that we're talking with people, particularly when we're discussing family matters, right? Especially where family members who work as a system have different types of relational cultures. And so chapter 1 gives us this great overview of the family configurations. We learn the nuclear family, the gay and lesbian family, extended family, step family, single parent family, and couples. Interestingly enough, there's some data coming out showing that single parent families are increasing in number in the United States. Very interesting trend to look at. So once we kind of learn all of these different models from chapter 1, we kind of fold it into a better understanding of it in chapter 2, where we got a good foundation of theory, right? Family theory. And so I've gotten a lot of questions about theory, so I'm going to discuss why this chapter is important. This kind of becomes the foundation of everything else we learn, simply because you can't really understand how communication works in families if you don't understand theory behind it. And theory is tried and true understandings of what happens when certain variables are at fact. And what that means is a theory basically just states the relationship between two different factors. So theories help us understand what's going to happen in families because they usually involve models or categories or things that help us predict and understand family interaction. So for example, we had systems theory, which helps us understand what happens when you view families as pieces of systems, right, that work together. We also looked at different theories such as I want to get to this one. Social construction theory, right? How families work together to create meaning. This theory helps us predict and understand flows of conversation in families, family stories, and how they impact family identity. And so all of these end up being quite important in understanding the family as a whole later on, because they become integral to our overall understanding of family behavior, right? So they kind of become good predictors for us. So I'm going to speed it right along to chapter 3 when we talked about rules and roles in families. Rules and roles are very fascinating to study because they're based in chapter 2's discussion of family theory. So how families interact usually has a direct correlation or relationship to how they end up settling into their roles and how they end up having different rules. So that's really important as well to remember. One of the key aspects that comes from this chapter is how roles affect family communication. And that's obviously why we are here, right? We're here trying to focus on and understand how we get roles, how we might switch roles, and how we become possessive of our roles. And that's kind of the key part of that. We talked about gender roles and gender schema theory. And then we also talked about how rules have different assumptions that then govern who can talk to who in a family, right? And so we talked about how rules, even though they're pretty firm, they can also be pretty malleable, right? And then, of course, we talked about secrets, and we talked about how families are governed by these secrets. But let's kind of get to the core of a lot of your questions that you had. By touching on chapter 4. And so chapter 4 was a fun chapter all about the external factors such as TV, media, that can impact a family. And so we can't pretend that a family is, of course, this singular system unit that is not influenced at all by other external factors. It most definitely is. And so Renisa, to your question, let's talk a little bit about the exosystem. Okay, so I think that exosystems are fascinating to study, but one of the key things is that you have to make sure that you study it within all these other systems so you understand the relationship. So very important that you don't just look at the definition of exosystem and be like, okay, I know the definition. It's about also knowing how does this exosystem interact with all these other systems. So I'm actually going to go through the system so you understand ultimately what an exosystem is. And so these are models of what we call ecological systems. So these are how we analyze the different layers of our lives. So think of it this way. When you all go to school or go to work or are with your families or with your friends, you're all interacting with different layers of your life, right? With different systems that you interact with. So the first level of that would be a microsystem, a system in which you live. So it could be the physical environment that you are immediately in. The mesosystem is the relationship between the microsystems. So between each microsystem, what do you have? So if my microsystem, for example, is my family, that's a system in which I live. A mesosystem would be the relationship between my family and my extended family, right? So I might not see my extended family very often, but they definitely do have a relationship. Then we have exosystems. So this was Renisa's question. She asked for more explanation on it. And exosystems are the connection between an individual and a social setting. So anytime you pick up your phone and go on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, and you read what's happening out there, or you go to your college campus, or you go to your local library, you go to a park, you're interacting with an exosystem of other people in a social setting. And this is important to recognize because you might, for example, have that microsystem of your family, and then you might have a mesosystem of an extended family or something else that your family interacts with. But you also have to take into account exosystems, because exosystems are maintained through social settings by other social entities. So basically an exosystem is studying what types of social situations and social structures do you interact with on a regular basis. And that's what an exosystem is. So an example of that Renisa, like I said, is definitely in this day and age social media, and different parts of social media can be different exosystems. So for example, I am a dog mom, and I really love being on Instagram and looking at other dog accounts and talking with other dog parents about training and feeding our dogs. And so that's an exosystem that I interact with, right? So it's not something that I absolutely, it's not a family system I'm part of. It's not something I do day to day. They're not people that, or a social setting that I have to interact with, but they are my exosystem because I connect with them. And then to a bigger level than that is the macro system, so the culture in which the family lives. So here we live in the United States, so we are subject to the macro system of American culture. And then, of course, none of us on this earth are, we're not all here. Everyone on this earth is not in America or in the same country per se, but everybody is subject to a chronos system, which is time, right? And so time is considered another system because as time moves and changes, so does the family, as we learned in chapter 2. And remember that all of these ideas connect, so it's important to recognize it that way. But Renisa, let me know if that answered your question. Sorry, I just read your chat where you said you need more understanding on how it's affected by culture. Rules are affected by culture. Oh, yes. So, for example, in the United States, we are an individualist culture, meaning that we live in a capitalist system, right, where the economy is based off of how much money companies are able to make. It's a very individualist, you got to work real hard to get what you want out of life system. And that's part of our American culture, right? It's part of that American dream. And so family rules become impacted by our culture simply because our culture dictates the way we think about things, right? So here in the United States, because we have this individualist culture that says, hey, like you have to work really hard to get what you want and go to school and, you know, build your career by yourself and do all of those things, that affects family rules because then the family rules start to mirror that, like, well, you know, family rules might be that a child must complete their homework before, you know, hanging out with their friends, right? So we create family rules in part because it's what we want as a family, but it's also because it's influenced by our culture and what our culture states is acceptable or not acceptable. So another example, Renisa, would be we have settled gender roles here in the United States where it's assumed that, you know, females, if they go out at night, are subject to more danger of being assaulted or hurt at night if they're out by themselves, but males are not. So a couple of my students and my friends have shared with me that when they were growing up, it was okay if their older brother, you know, went out at night, but their parents would not let them as young females go out at night. So that's another rule that families have that is impacted by our culture, Renisa. Does that make sense? I'll give you an opposing country example so you understand. So in Japan, for example, those gender roles are not super hard pressed, right? They're not as strict. And also culturally in Japan, they have lower rates of crime. And so when I was living in Japan, for example, for a short amount of time, I was free to go out at night, like really late at night, up until like 1 a.m., 2 a.m. and take the train home. And I absolutely did not feel in danger at all or feel like at all worried that I was alone. And that's because their culture there is different, and also they have lower crime rates. So families there do not have rules about when girls can go out or not go out because the whole macro system, right? The living of in Japan, the country of Japan, the culture of Japan, doesn't really require you to have different rules for your girls and your boys. Does that make sense, Renisa? And so here, though, in the United States, because, you know, it's very common knowledge that it's very dangerous for young girls, especially in the city, to go out by themselves late at night versus males, families might institute rules, right, and treat their female children and male children differently. So that's an example of how the macro system impacts both the meso and micro systems, right? So these are all kind of layers of your life that you have to interact with regardless of whether or not you like it. They're influenced they influence yourself personally, they influence your family as a whole. Yes, Renee says, very true. I wish we do have that here, right? And so it's an interesting kind of interaction to see if you've ever traveled to Japan or traveled to any of those countries. In the East, it's a very different type of macro system to explore. All right, so Renisa, let me know if you have any other questions. I'm happy to answer them. Jacqueline has asked, what system would a romantic relationship fall under? That would be under your microsystem, Jackie. So it would be everybody that is within your microsystem. It would depend on the level of which you are in that relationship, if that makes sense, Jackie. So let's say you just met someone and you just start dating that person and you don't live together and, you're still kind of learning your relationship. They would probably be a little bit more in the mesosystem because you're not as connected to them. But let's say you live with them or you see them very, very regularly, right, all the time, then they would be part of your microsystem more, right? They actually become part of your microsystem the moment you introduce them to your microsystem. So if you let them stay over at your place or meet your family or whatever, if you invite them into your microsystem and they're there regularly, they become part of your microsystem, Jacqueline. So I hope that answers Jacqueline's question. Janae has asked a couple questions. She says, I'm having trouble developing questions for a courtship story. Should we ask them about what rewards and costs, or should we analyze this ourselves? I'm going to go ahead and pull up our family narrative slides, Janae, so I can answer that question for you. Give me 1 second. Oop, I have too many tabs open in my brain, per the usual. All right, Janae, so let me go ahead and answer this question for you. Let me get to the slide on analysis. 1 second. There we go. So one of the things we need to know is that as you're interviewing your people for your stories, you're looking at all these elements that we discussed in chapter 6, Janae. And one of the key things that you want to think of is, I think it's a both and. I think that you are more than capable of analyzing it yourself depending on your answers. So let's say, Janae, they when you ask someone for a courtship story and they talk about how they met, your parents are talking about how they met, your uncle and aunt are talking about how they met, something like that. You can analyze it based off the way they tell the story. So I would actually recommend waiting and to see if they say communication patterns such as, well, at first, I was really busy with school or work, but then, I was so in love with him that I, decided to start dating him, right? That's an example, Janae, of deciding on the rewards and costs of a relationship. So Janae, as you mentioned, they might start giving you naturally indicators of rewards and costs of their relationship, such as that. But if you feel like they haven't given you enough, or you feel like they haven't given you very clear answers on that aspect, I think at the end you can wait and say and rephrase the question and say, well, if you look at your relationship, what have been like the more difficult, costly parts of it, and what have been the best rewards that have come out of it, Janae? And you can be very direct with them. But most of the time, people will infuse within their narratives, especially courtship stories, they'll infuse their decisions that they made on whether or not they decided to date the person or not, right? And so it'll usually naturally come most of the time, Janae, but I expect it to for most people, but if they don't, I would recommend just asking directly so you have that information afterwards. Luis has asked on chapter 4, identifying how social media impacts families. So we were just there, so let's rewind back to chapter 4, 1 second. But Janae and Renisa, I hope I answered your questions. Please let me know in the chat if I did. And if you have any other questions, of course, if you want to keep building off of that or you have more questions, I am here to answer them. But let's go over to Luis's question right here. So Luis has asked about discussing how social media impacts families, right? And so I actually have a slide where I kind of distill out and list the different ways that social media impacts families. So it should be located right here. So family communication is impacted by social media in the following ways. You might remember that I actually had you do an assignment related to this question. what we do know about social media, again, remember that social media is very new. So even family scholars right now that are trying to develop theories on how families interact with social media, it's still budding, right? It's still new, it's still growing, because social media has really only boomed in the last maybe 5 to 10 years, and we're still really learning a lot about how it's affecting families. But what we do know are these 5 things. Families usually engage in conflict as a result of it. We usually have families that fight over things like just, Wi-Fi and like who's streaming what and who's taking up too much of the Wi-Fi bandwidth. And also family members can engage in conflict just because of social media use itself. So I have heard from different students, even in this class, talk about how that you've observed your family members on Facebook getting into fights with each other on social media. So we know that social media becomes a source of conflict because of its use in families. But on the positive aspect, parents have this kind of new network, this new macro system, if you will, this new system that helps them improve their parenting that they didn't have before. So way back in the day when we didn't have social media, when we couldn't connect people from different walks of life very easily, we had parents basically either just asking other parents, face to face, like, how did you approach this problem with your children? How did you do this? How did you do that? And now we have full networks of parents on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Reddit, on forums, what have you, that can actually ask other parents like, hey, I have a child that is on the autism spectrum. How do I approach this? Or how do I approach that problem? And so that has been, I think, really awesome to see, and that social media can offer parents this new way of parenting, right? Of finding out the best way to be the best parents themselves. We also know that social media does connect families in meaningful ways, especially if you have an extended family that you don't see very often. It can actually be really great to feel like you're more connected to them if you're able to see what they're doing on Instagram and on Facebook, right? You kind of feel like you're up to date on their life. You don't have to wait until Thanksgiving to be like, hey, what have you been doing all year, right? I can catch up with my family almost every day just by using social media. We tend to see that it doesn't seem to replace family talk time too much. It tends to replace TV viewing time. And some students were a little confused by this, so I'm going to clarify. So it's not to say that social media doesn't discourage talking. We definitely know that social media and technology in general, like using your phone, whatever, your tablet, being on your phone at home with your family is a problem for a lot of families, right? Because sometimes you might spend too much time on your phone and not talk as much to your family. So that happens. But this is not, this second to last statement does not say that doesn't happen. What it's trying to say is what we usually used to do as families was watch TV. And now that TV watching time is being replaced with streaming, Netflix, with being on social media. And so all that statement is saying is that we are simply replacing all that time we would just watch TV with social media. That's not to say that we're also not talking to each other, because that also is very possible that we're not talking to each other either, right? So don't confuse those two ideas, right? And so that doesn't mean that it doesn't encroach on family talk time. It just means that what we used to do, watching TV all the time before social media was even invented, now social media is replacing that time. Because before, families would also just watch TV and not talk either, right? So we can't necessarily just blame social media either for families not interacting, because even back then, families would just watch TV, right, and not talk either. The Simpsons even were kind of teasing this idea, right? If you ever remember watching The Simpsons, in their intro, the family would rush home just to watch TV. And so it's this idea that TV was this thing that overtook family social interaction and family time. But now we know that social media is kind of replacing that TV aspect, in addition to also encroaching upon other family interactions. And lastly, families are created through social media. This is absolutely crazy to think about. It's so awesome to study as someone that is interested in these kind of trends. Back in the day, when online dating was first kind of invented and thought of, I think there was a lot of stigma behind it, right? It would be like, oh, like you met your husband online? Like, that's weird. And now 1 out of every 5 couples have met online. And then on top of that, you're able to adopt children, right? So not only can you actually find a partner to live with, but you can also adopt children online, right? Through social media. Not through social media, but because of social media and other internet-based networking sites, which is absolutely crazy, because before you'd have to be most likely a more wealthy family with access to a lawyer, with access to other resources that would help you be able to find children to adopt if you chose to adopt. And now you are more able to access adoption information and potential children to adopt just by using the platform of the internet at your fingertips, right? So it's really kind of reduced the distance created in the past when we didn't have this technology. Of course, it's also made it a little bit more, not a little bit, much more dangerous, but it's very interesting to see this advent of creation of new microsystems through social media. So Luis, I hope that kind of gave you a good overview of how social media impacts families. Whoa, I have more questions. Renisa has one more question, and Zidali has one more question. So, sorry, I'm trying to read through all this stuff. I'm really excited that you guys have so many questions. Zidali has asked, my question is based on chapter 5, mostly the difference between disqualifying, reframing, and neutralizing. I believe that's where I had most trouble taking the quiz. And Renisa has asked a question on chapter 4. So, Zidali, real quick, I'm going to answer Renisa's question because we're still here on chapter 4. So let me move on to answering Renisa's question real quick, and then we'll move on to chapter 5, Zidali, where I'm going to answer your question. One second, let me start pulling up my slides. I am very excited, you guys. All right. So let me reread Sidali's question again. Thank you for your patience as I stuck my face into my thing trying to change things. So Sidali asked a good question. She said, what are the differences between disqualifying, framing, and neutralizing from chapter 5? So real quick, remember that chapter 5 is about creating intimacy in families. Intimacy here relates to this idea of creating not physical intimacy only, but feeling like I'm interacting with someone, that I have a strong relationship with someone, right? And so that's what that refers to. And so what Sidali is asking about are these different ideas regarding managing dialectical tensions. So Sidali, let me kind of step back and review dialectical tensions first, and then I'll talk about your question specifically. So the people in relationships are always in tension, and that's what the dialectical approach talks about. And that's true to an extent, right? Relationships are work. It's not like we get into a relationship, either romantic, friendship, family, all of the above. We're always constantly having to maintain our relationships, right? We always have to put work in, basically, is what I'm trying to say. And so as we're trying to put work into our relationships, what we get are tensions or opposing ideas. One person wants one thing, the other person wants another thing, or they prefer to do things in different ways, and that kind of pulls into different directions. And so the dialectic approach says that you build intimacy, or you build strong relationships by basically negotiating or fixing or talking about these tensions. The dialectic approach says that everybody's going to have these tensions. Everybody's going to have these problems. It's just how you deal with them is the most important, right? So the the chapter gives you these ideas of how to manage them, right? And so they say that successful people in families are able to execute these different strategies. And so this is what Citali is asking about. She's asking about the differences between these different, between disqualifying, reframing, and neutralizing, right? Disqualifying is when you ignore one of the tensions altogether. So you decide that, Citali, you want to save money, but I kind of want to spend money right now, right? So that's a common tension in families, right? Like, do we save money? Do we spend money? What do we do about money? And so I just completely ignore that issue, right? We don't talk about it. We don't discuss it. We don't talk about money at all. And of course, that's not completely healthy all the time, especially when it comes to serious issues. But that's an example, Citali, where let's say you want to spend money, I want to save money, or vice versa, and we just end up just not talking about money at all. So that's disqualifying. We just ignore it completely and we pretend like this tension isn't there. Reframing is when you redefine it to make it seem like, hey, it can work together, or hey, we can figure out a way to collaborate and work together on this. So instead of thinking of it as, hey, you want to save money, I want to spend money, let's reframe it as, we need to have better discussions about how we manage our money, right? So at this point, it's about managing money, not just us having difference of opinions. So what reframing does is it helps us almost seem to kind of get rid of the tension, right? It makes it seem like, no, like we're on the same page actually, right? We're actually thinking the same thing. Another example of that would be privacy. So in this era of social media, couples, especially romantic couples, are having a hard time with figuring out to what extent they get access to each other's phones. Some couples are totally okay with it. Some couples have a problem with it, right? And some couples are like, I don't want you touching my phone at all, or I only want you touching my phone when I'm around, things like that. And so let's say one couple wants full access to their significant other's phone, and the other person's like, I don't really want you to touch my phone ever. So from a dialectical perspective, those seem like opposing ideas, right? Opposite ideas. But if you want to reframe them, Citali, what you would do is say, hey, babe, it's not that I don't trust you and I want to look at your phone. It's that I want you to feel like we could both trust each other and both be able to not look at each other's phones, to trust each other, to look at each other's phones or not look at each other's phones. It's about trust. It's not about privacy. So that's a way to reframe it to make it seem like that the opposing ideas are not there, right? I'll repeat that example one more time. So let's say, again, you don't want someone to look at your phone. They want full access to your phone. Opposite tensions, opposite dialectics, right? If you chose to reframe it, you would say, hey, it's not about me trying to go into your phone and violate your privacy. It's that I really want to feel like you trust me enough with your phone. So I reframed it and made the issue about trust and not about invasion of privacy. Does that make sense? And so, of course, everybody in the relationship wants trust, right, to be a guiding principle in your relationship. And so that's an opportunity to reframe it. Neutralizing is when you compromise. It's different from reframing, even though I know it can be a little confusing. Reframing is when you collaborate to make it seem like it's one unifying idea, right? You get rid of the opposition. You get rid of it looking like they're different ideas. You make it seem like they're the same idea. You make it seem like you're on the same page. Neutralizing is when you decide to both give up something. That's a compromise, right? So I'm going to give up this, you give up this. So neutralizing, if I'm going to go back to my saving money or spending money example, let's say if you chose to neutralize that tension, you would say, okay, you get to spend a maximum of $200 a month on extra things, and I will save $200 a month, right? So we each kind of give up something and get something in return, right? And so neutralizing sometimes can be a good strategy when you kind of can't reframe it. And so you each kind of give up something like, okay, like you want me to save money? Fine. I'll save some money. I'll save like $50 or $200. And then the other person will say like, fine, you want to spend money? Okay, we can go out once a week then, right? So they kind of give up something that they kind of necessarily don't want to do, but they do it because the other person is also giving up something in that tension. So I hope that answers your question, Citali. Of course, I know this can be confusing, so if you want more examples, let me know. Renisa has asked, the last quiz question, how Bobby's grandfather is sharing the story about growing up in the USSR. Can you explain why that was narrative influence? All right, let's get to our narrative story again. We're bouncing back and forth between 4, 5, and 6, and those are the juicy chapters, so I'm excited. So let me take a look at this. Let me get out of chapter 4 real quick. To my slide. Narrative influence. Oop, my bad. Sorry, guys. Un momento. There we go. Okie pokey. So we get to family stories. So, thank you for your patience. Renisa asked on the last quiz question how Bobby's grandfather was sharing the story about what it was like growing up in the USSR. Can you explain why it was narrative influence? So if I remember that question correctly, Renisa, I don't have it in front of me, but if I remember writing it correctly, it was about Bobby's grandfather, and he kind of shared what it was like. He shared to his grandson what it was like growing up in the USSR, which for those of you who don't know doesn't exist anymore. It's Russia now, but and so this idea of showing of telling another family member that was not there, right? So obviously Bobby was not able to experience growing up in the USSR, is an example of narrative influence, because what he's doing is he's trying to impart this kind of lore. Like I use the word lore here, but I'm trying to find a different example. Experience, right? So Renisa, I believe you meant to type narrative inherence, not narrative influence. So it should be narrative inherence. This idea that you pass things on, right? That you pass on links between past, present, and future, right? So you as an older individual in the family give your child some sense of identity, like a piece of your identity, by being like, this is how it was for me growing up. So that's what it should be, Renisa, because that's what Bobby's grandfather is doing, right? So Bobby's not really going to ever know what it was like growing up in the USSR, and he's not going to really care unless his grandfather tells him a story about how it connects to his grandfather's life. Miguel, quiz 6, question 2 wouldn't answer. Building identity in the lecture size, I can't, Miguel, I'm not sure. It has building links as a definition for building identity. No, Miguel, my lecture slides say building identity. The definition of that is creating links between past, present, and future. So they're one in the same thing. Let me just go straight to the quiz question, y'all, so I know what y'all talking about. Because now I'm like, huh, how was it written? I'm now curious. 1 second. Let's take a look. A look-see. So, Miguel is asking about question number 2. It is still loading. 1 second. So the question is, John tells his daughter stories about himself, his father, and grandfather. Stories serve what purpose of narrative inheritance? It's creating links to past, present, future, right? So himself, his father, and grandfather. I tried to make that kind of explicit in the question because it's about himself, which is the present, his father, the past, and grandfather, right? So these links between past, present, and future are big in the creation of identity. So it's not just creation of identity, it's creation of identity specifically through past, present, and future. Because the whole point of family stories is that you don't just get an identity from telling the story itself, you get a piece of identity because those links are created for you, right? So back to the example of Bobby's grandfather telling him, you know, this is how life was for me. You're building building a piece of that identity into Bobby, right? So Bobby, as the new generation, has never experienced what his grandfather experienced, but it's now becoming a small part of his identity because his grandfather's creating those links between past, present, and future. Because no doubt, those stories that he tells will be linked to the future. So for example, a lot of immigrant stories are like this, where their parents who have immigrated to the United States will tell their children, hey, in the past, we immigrated and these were our struggles. So in the future, this is what we hope for you. The storyteller has to create the links between this is what happened in the past, we immigrated, so in the future, this is what we want to see. So the best answer for that question, Miguel, was not just building identity, it was creating past, present, and future links. Okay? So I hope that clarifies. I didn't mean for that to be a tricky question, y'all. I meant to try to make it explicit by being like, dad, father, grandfather, like past, present, future. Because I tried to drive home the point that we only build identity by creating these links, right? Through family stories. Identity doesn't just happen, right? Because imagine if your parents were immigrants and they just sat you down and said, hey, we immigrated here. And then you'd be like, hey, that's cool. And then that would be it, right? So the storyteller, the whole point of this narrative and the whole point of this slide and the whole point of this whole chapter is that the storyteller, the person telling the story, has to create those links. They have to say something like, we immigrated here, we had all these struggles, all this stuff happened, so we want something better for you, the future, right? The next generation. And so the person hearing the story, right? The person, their child, that's now a part of their identity. Does that make sense? So even though they did not immigrate here, being an immigrant becomes part of their identity. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. So I hope I didn't skip over anyone's questions. Please forgive me if I did. Let me know if I did, because there's so much rich questions going on here in the chat that I may have missed it. So if I did, please let me know now. And if you have any other questions, please let me know now. Otherwise, if you don't, I can go ahead and conclude. So while I'm waiting for you guys to type in and let me know everything's good, or if you have more questions, I'm gonna sip my bubbly water. Renisa, the study guide is available. So Renisa has asked, the study guide is actually all of your course objectives. So I've kind of already embedded study guides into each module. So let me show you where you can find them, if you haven't noticed them already. One second, it's loading. So if you take a look at each week, right, you'll see that we have learning objectives for every single week. These are your study guides. So I used to do like a one Word document study guide, and I would give it to you at the midterm, and I'm like, why am I waiting to give it to them during the midterm? Why don't I give it to them for every chapter so that they know what they should be focusing on? And so for every chapter, you have learning objectives. This is what I expect you to be able to do at the end of the chapter. Notice that it doesn't cover the whole chapter, so I'm actually letting you know, like, hey, this is what I want you to focus on. Some objectives cover the whole chapter. Some of them pick out things that I want you to pay attention to specifically. So these are your study guides, Renisa. So I've embedded them in here so that you can kind of see. So for chapter 3, for example, this is what you should do. And so I like that because as you're studying each chapter, you can kind of check in with yourself to be like, hey, can I do that? Can I do that? Can I do that? Jacqueline, you can always email me or set up another meeting if you have further questions anytime throughout the semester. So if you need to review for the midterm or anything like that, you can just send me a message on Canvas and we can set up some sort of video chat meeting or phone call, and we can work through any other questions or comments that you have regarding the midterm or the project itself. yourself. But there you go. How exciting. Anything else? Good questions. Good questions. Is everyone good? Give me like some sort of, we're all good. Thank you, Renisa. I'm glad someone admires my lecture slides. Renisa just said she likes my lecture slides. She says they're cute. Thank you. I try a little bit to make it not as boring as PowerPoint. I try. So as I'm waiting for Sidley, I think she has one more question to write. One thing I want to remind you of is that when your midterm is due, or you'll have a week of time to do it. So there is obviously a deadline to it, but you're more than happy to take it anytime between the day it opens and the day it closes, okay? Make sure that you give yourself enough time to complete it. So if it's due at 11:59 p.m., don't start it at 11:30 because Canvas will cut you off at 11:59 p.m. even if you're still in the midterm, right? So even if you have it open and you're doing it, Canvas will shut you down at 11:59 p.m. So that means you need to start it long before 11:59 p.m. to give yourself enough time to do it. There is a time limit. I believe it's 90 minutes, but don't quote me on that. But there is a time limit to it. I try to give you the same amount of time that my face-to-face classes would get. So, I treat my online classes and face-to-face classes the same, so you get the same amount of time. It is multiple choice, and you get one shot at it. Of course, you being here with your extra credit will help as well, but do try to study hard and do your best. Citly. Oh, fluidity. I know exactly where that is. It is here in these slides. Un momento. So it is one of the, I don't know why this is tripping right now, y'all. So fluidity is one of the concepts related to family stories, Citly. And so all it states is that family stories can change over time. What that means is that when you tell a story, how you tell it to your children isn't really going to be how your children tell it to their children, and so on and so forth. The story might change. There might be more drama and suspense added to it. Different details might be filled in because they don't remember. And so family stories ebb and flow and change over time, right? So my mom's stories that she's told me about living in Vietnam and immigrating here, when I tell my kids that, the way I tell that story and how that story is kind of given to my child is going to be different from how my mother told it to me, right? Because I'm a different person and I also didn't experience what my mother experienced. And so what that refers to is that over time, as stories are passed on from generation to generation, they change. It's kind of like that game of telephone, right? When you tell someone something and it changes over time, over and over. And so we can't consider family stories to be stagnant all the time because they change depending on who's telling them, who's hearing them, and what purpose they're serving to build identity, right? So when my mom tells me a story about her being an immigrant here, it impacts my identity because I'm her daughter, and so it reminds me that I have to work really hard, right? And take care of myself and build my career and work on my education and all of those factors because of her sacrifices. But when I tell my children that same exact immigration story, they're probably not going to feel as directly connected to it. So I'm going to have to use it to build their identity in a different way. I'm going to have to say, hey, grandma was an immigrant, so you should work really hard. Because they're not as, directly connected as I am being her direct child. So I might have to tell the story by saying something like, hey, grandma made a lot of sacrifices and immigrated to be here. And so it's really important that you recognize how important hard work is, right? And so I kind of make it more applicable to their lives, right? And the story changes a little bit on how we develop identity to Italy. And so all that means is that we can't expect stories to stay the same. They're fluid, they change depending on who's telling them, who hears them, and for what reason, right? For what reason are we telling this story? My mother told me her immigration story to ensure that I would work hard. I might be telling the immigration story to my children so that they learn to respect their heritage. Different reasons, right? And so that's an example, Italy. All right. Last call for questions after this. I'm gonna again sip my bubble of water. So my voice gets a little tired when I'm talking straight for an hour and a half and trying to project into this microphone. Right well. But I hope you all have a good time during spring break. Get a little chance to relax, catch up, review for the exam as necessary, right? It's not during spring break. I'm a little evil, but I'm not that evil. Of a teacher, I would hope so. You're nothing is particularly due during spring break. Of course, you're welcome to contact me and work on it. Of course, work on things for our class during spring break, but I try to kind of give you spring break off so you can have a little bit of a breather. Jacqueline, no, the midterm cannot be reopened. So once you open it, that's it. You have to sit there and take it. And again, that's not me being mean or anything. I'm not trying to just impose rules just for the sake of it. It's really because I want you to be treated the same way my face-to-face students are treated, and I don't want to give my online students any more privileges than my face-to-face students. So if my face-to-face students don't get the chance to redo an exam or take it and then leave and come back, I can't give you that same privilege as well, to be fair. So I want you to open it and then take it when you open it, if that makes sense, right? In the same way that when my face-to-face students come to class to take the exam, they have to take it and they have to finish it all in one setting, right? So for equity amongst all my students, you have to take it and complete it once you open it. Okay. Of course, if there are technical issues like your computer crashes or something happens, contact me and let me know. Or if it freezes on you, screenshot it, send it to me. Anytime there are issues, always screenshot so that I can see what's going on and troubleshoot for you and help you. Otherwise, it will be difficult for me to help you, okay? So always screenshot, or if there are any issues, just let me know, Jacqueline. But ideally, yes, you're supposed to sit there, take the exam, finish it. I don't think it will take you, honestly, the full time. It shouldn't. It's multiple choice, and most students will get through it within an hour, if not less than that, depending on how fast you read and answer the questions. It is expected, of course, that you study in advance so that you're not opening the exam for the first time and then opening your textbook. Of course, I've tried to write the questions to make them example and application-based questions, so to try to discourage you from doing that. I would not recommend the strategy of, I'll just have my textbook open and take the exam at the same time. Yes, I guess that is an option. I can't stop you. I'm not going to kick down your house door and be like, hey, stop that. But I would not recommend it as a strategy because I honestly don't think it'll be helpful to you, because you'll just be scrambling to look for different answers rather than just answering the questions, right? And students also tend to overthink when they have their textbook in front of them. So you might know the answer, but then with your textbook, check it and then change your answer. And we've all been there as students. I've done it too, where I had the right answer and then I changed it because I overthought it. So again, just study in advance, review, and then when you feel ready, take the exam and finish it in that one setting. Okie dokie? All right, I got to get going into another meeting, but as always, as Jacqueline said, any other questions, let me know. I'm always here to help you. I will sort of be around during spring break, so but it will take me a little bit longer to respond to messages. So if you don't hear from me right away, please be patient, because I will be traveling a little bit during spring break. And so I will try to get back to you as soon as I can. Okie dokie. Have a fantastic spring break and the rest of your week. I will see you all online, and I'll also be answering your questions for the midterm review. So I'll see you all then. Bye. Have a good week. Good luck studying for my class and other classes.